The house was a steal, or so everyone told me. Nestled on the edge of the Appalachian wilderness, the sprawling Victorian manor stood like a forgotten relic of an era long past. Its turrets reached skyward like crooked fingers, and its windows, clouded with grime, seemed to follow my every move as I approached the front door. The realtor, a wiry woman with a practiced smile, handed me the keys and chirped, "It's a fixer-upper, but I'm sure you'll make it feel like home." I moved in alone, seeking solace after a brutal breakup. My therapist had insisted that a change of scenery would help me rediscover myself, and I, in my desperate state, had latched onto the idea like a drowning man clutching driftwood. I told myself that the strange creaks and groans I heard as I unpacked were just the house settling. After all, it had been empty for decades. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful, though unsettling. The old radiators hissed like venomous snakes, and the wind clawed at the eaves, making the house feel alive. I didn't sleep well. Shadows seemed to shift and writhe on the walls, and a faint tapping sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. "Just old pipes," I muttered to myself, pulling the covers tighter around me. But even then, a sense of being watched prickled the back of my neck. The second night was when things began to change. I was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to use the ancient gas stove when I heard it, a soft, lilting hum. It was a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting down the grand staircase. My heart stuttered. I froze, straining to listen. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Gathering my courage, I climbed the stairs, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. At the top, the air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I checked every room, throwing open doors with shaky hands. They were all empty. But in the far corner of the master bedroom, I found something that made my stomach drop. An old rocking chair, swaying gently as though someone had just stood up from it. By the third night, the house had stopped pretending to be benign. I woke to the sound of shattering glass and bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering. "Who's there?" I shouted, fumbling for the baseball bat I'd kept by my bedside since moving in. The house didn't answer, but when I crept downstairs, I found the living room mirror cracked, a jagged fissure running through its center. Written in the condensation of the cold glass were 3 chilling words: "Get out now." Still, I stayed. Stubbornness? Foolishness? Perhaps both. But the next morning, as I scrubbed away the message with trembling hands, I told myself that someone had broken in, that this was some cruel prank. Denial was easier than confronting the truth. Then came the voices. They started as whispers in the dead of night, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I'd lie awake, my heart pounding, straining to make out the words. Once, I thought I heard my name. Another time, I was certain I heard laughter, a low, mocking chuckle that made my blood run cold. And still, I stayed. On the 4th night, the terror became undeniable. I woke to find my bedroom door wide open, though I knew I had locked it before going to bed. The air was icy, and my breath misted in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. And then, from the hallway, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I didn't wait to see who or what was there. Grabbing my bat, I fled down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold wood. I reached the front door and yanked it open, gasping for air as I stumbled into the night. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but when I turned back to the house, I saw her. A shadowy figure standing in the window of the master bedroom, her face obscured but her presence undeniable. The house wasn't just haunted. It was waiting. I spent the next morning trying to convince myself I hadn't seen her. Maybe it was the moonlight playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress, or residual fear from the cracked mirror incident. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong with this house, and it wasn't going to let me ignore it. Determined to understand what I was dealing with, I headed to the local library. The librarian, an elderly man with a tuft of white hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, seemed reluctant to help at first. When I mentioned the address, his expression darkened. "You're living there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied. "Why? Do you know something about it?" He hesitated, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. Then, leaning closer, he said, That house has a history. Back in the 1920s, it belonged to the Whitmore family. They were wealthy, powerful, and troubled. The youngest daughter, Eleanor, was found dead in the master bedroom. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but there were rumors, dark ones. What kind of rumors? I pressed. People said she was disturbed, claimed she heard voices, saw things no one else could see. The family tried to keep it quiet, but after her death, they left the house. No one stayed there for long after that. Strange things happened. Disappearances, accidents. Some say Eleanor never left. The story sent a chill down my spine. Why hasn't anyone torn it down? Some places are better left alone, he said simply before shuffling away. Armed with this grim knowledge, I returned to the house. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. Every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. I decided to stay awake that night, to watch and wait. If Eleanor, or whatever presence lingered, wanted to communicate, I would be ready. Midnight came and went, the house eerily silent. I sat in the living room, clutching a flashlight, my eyes darting to every flicker of movement. And then, just as I was beginning to think the house might leave me in peace, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air, and the hum began again, a mournful melody that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Eleanor?" I called, my voice shaking. "Is that you?" The hum stopped, replaced by a low, guttural moan. The chandelier overhead began to sway, its crystals jingling like wind chimes. A cold wind rushed through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panicked, I scrambled for the nearest lamp, fumbling with the switch. When the light flickered on, I saw her. She stood at the base of the staircase, her form translucent but unmistakable. A young woman in a tattered white dress, her hair cascading around her pale, hollow face. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow, anger, and something else. Something ancient and malevolent. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't speak, but her gaze shifted to the wall beside me. Slowly I turned to look. Written in what appeared to be blood were the words, "Leave while you can." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Why? What's keeping you here? Who did this to you?" She raised a hand, her bony finger pointing toward the master bedroom. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chandelier stopped swaying, the room grew warmer, and I was left alone with the ominous message. I knew I should leave, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was the raw pain in her eyes, or the way she had looked at me, not with hatred, but with pleading desperation. Eleanor was trying to tell me something, and I couldn't abandon her without knowing what it was. As dawn broke, I resolved to uncover the truth. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever bound Eleanor to it, I would find it. And I would survive. The next day, I forced myself to confront the master bedroom. The room that Eleanor had pointed to. The room where the rocking chair had moved on its own. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting an illusion of normalcy. But the air inside was heavy and oppressive, as though the walls themselves carried a burden. I began my search, starting with the furniture. The wardrobe was empty, except for a faint whiff of mothballs. The dresser drawers held only dust and the occasional spider. Then I moved to the bed, a massive four-poster with intricately carved details. It groaned as I knelt to peer underneath, and there, among the cobwebs and forgotten debris, I found a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, the edges frayed. Inside, the handwriting was neat but slanted, the ink faded to sepia. The journal belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. With trembling hands, I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding with each new revelation. At first, the entries were mundane. Descriptions of her day, the weather, her family. But as I read on, the tone darkened. Eleanor wrote of strange occurrences. Hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and feeling as though someone was always watching her. "Mother says it's just my imagination," one entry read. "But I know the truth. There's something evil in this house." The final entries were the most chilling. Eleanor spoke of nightmares so vivid they left her shaking, of an unseen force that seemed to pull her toward the master bedroom window. "It wants me to jump," she wrote. "It whispers to me, promises an end to the pain. I'm scared. I don't want to die." The last page was stained, the ink smudged as though written in a hurry. "I think it's Father," it read. "He's been different since the seance. He brought something into this house, something that won't let go. If you find this, please forgive me. I have no choice. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. A seance? Her father had invited something into the house, something that had driven Eleanor to her death. And now it was trying to claim me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I prepared for what I knew would be a harrowing night. I gathered what supplies I could: salt, candles, a Bible I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't sure what I was up against, but I knew I had to face it. Eleanor's ghost wasn't the enemy. She was a victim, trapped by the same malevolent force that now haunted me. Night fell and the house grew eerily silent. I sat in the master bedroom, the journal open in my lap, a ring of salt encircling me. Hours passed, and then, just as the clock struck midnight, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air and the hum began again, faint at first but growing louder. This time, it wasn't Eleanor's voice. It was deeper, guttural, and filled with rage. The walls began to shake, the chandelier overhead swaying violently. Shadows slithered across the room, coalescing into a dark, towering figure at the foot of the bed. Its eyes glowed red, and its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread. "You should have left," it growled, its voice reverberating through my very bones. "I'm not leaving until I free her," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "You can't have her. You won't have me." The entity roared, a sound that shook the windows and sent books flying off the shelves. It lunged toward me, but the salt barrier held, sparks flying as it collided with the invisible boundary. "She belongs to me," it snarled. "As will you." Desperate, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "This ends tonight," I shouted. "You've taken enough from her." The figure paused, its form flickering as though caught between worlds. The room filled with a deafening cacophony, whispers, screams, and the sound of shattering glass. And then, from the shadows, Eleanor appeared. She stood beside me, her form faint but resolute. "She's not yours anymore," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "Let her go." The entity roared one final time before dissolving into the darkness. The house grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as though a curse had been broken. Eleanor turned to me, her expression one of profound relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades of torment. And then she was gone, her form fading into the first rays of dawn. When the first light of dawn touched the house, it felt different. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to every corner was gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. It was as if the house itself had exhaled after years of suffocating under an invisible weight. I sat on the floor of the master bedroom, drained but alive, the journal still clutched in my trembling hands. Eleanor was free. I was sure of that. The entity, whatever it was, had been banished, its connection to this place severed. But the battle had left me shaken, and I knew I couldn't stay. The house wasn't my home anymore. It had been a battleground, a prison for a tortured soul, and a dark chapter of my life I would never forget. I packed hastily, throwing clothes and essentials into bags without care for organization. As I worked, I thought about Eleanor. She had been so young, so full of life before her father's tragic mistake. The journal hinted at a girl with dreams, with hopes and fears like anyone else, cut down by forces she couldn't fight. In some strange way, I felt a kinship with her. We had both been trapped by circumstances beyond our control, but unlike her, I had escaped. Before leaving, I returned to the master bedroom one last time. The room was quiet, the air lighter than it had ever been. On impulse, I placed the journal on the windowsill. It felt wrong to take it with me. It belonged here, a testament to Eleanor's story and her courage. "Rest in peace," I murmured, and for the first time, I felt like she truly could. The drive away from the house was surreal. The world outside seemed brighter, more vibrant, as though I had been living in a shadow and hadn't realized it until now. I passed the library on my way out of town and felt a pang of gratitude for the old librarian. Without his stories, I might not have known what I was up against. A week later, I was settled in a small apartment in the city, far from the haunting isolation of the Victorian manor. But even as I tried to rebuild my life, the memories lingered. At night, I sometimes heard faint whispers, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Old habits died hard, and the scars of that house were etched deep in my mind. One evening, as I was unpacking, I found something that stopped me cold. A single page from Eleanor's journal. I didn't remember taking it, but there it was, tucked between the pages of one of my books. The words were scrawled hastily, the ink smudged. "Thank you for believing me." Tears welled in my eyes as I read the words. Eleanor's torment was over, but she had left a piece of herself with me, a reminder of her strength and the bond we had shared, however fleeting. I folded the page carefully and placed it in a frame. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a symbol of hope, of survival, and of the courage it took to face the darkness. In the years that followed, I made peace with what had happened. The experience changed me, reshaped my understanding of fear, resilience, and the things that linger in the shadows. I never spoke of the house to anyone, but sometimes, late at night, I would light a candle and think of Eleanor. I hoped that wherever she was, she had found the peace she deserved. The house was eventually sold, but I never went back. Some places are better left alone, and that house was one of them. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if the new owners ever felt the cold wind, heard the whispers, or saw the faintest shadow of a girl in a white dress. If they did, I hoped they would listen, as I had. Sometimes, the living and the dead have stories to share, and it takes a brave heart to hear them. As for me, I survived. And though I'll never forget the haunted house and the ghost who saved me, I've learned to live again. My story isn't just one of fear, it's one of survival, and the unyielding human spirit that can shine even in the darkest of places. The house stood at the end of Blackthorn Road, cloaked in a perpetual shadow that the sun seemed reluctant to penetrate. It was the kind of place children dared each other to approach, and adults spoke of in hushed tones, claiming it was cursed. When I first saw it, its warped windows and peeling paint gave me chills. Still, I needed the escape, and the rent was cheap, a necessity for someone rebuilding their life after losing everything. The landlord, a pale man with sunken eyes, seemed too eager to hand over the keys. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once you sign the lease, it's yours, no refunds." I laughed nervously, chalking his warning up to small-town theatrics. "I'll take it." The moment I stepped inside, the air felt thick, almost alive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The wooden floors groaned under my weight, and the wallpaper, once floral and bright, was now faded, curling at the edges like ancient parchment. There was something off about the silence, as though the house was listening. The first night, I unpacked only the essentials and settled into the dusty bedroom on the second floor. Sleep was elusive. A faint tapping echoed through the walls, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking to be let in. I told myself it was the wind. By the third night, I wasn't so sure. The tapping grew louder, joined by soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were indistinct, a maddening hum of unintelligible words. My cat, Luna, hissed at the corner of the room, her fur standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a void so profound it was deafening. The next morning, I searched the house, hoping to find a rational explanation. Maybe there were raccoons in the attic or old pipes that made odd noises. But the attic was empty, save for a single wooden chest. Its brass latch was rusted shut, and it bore the initials EL, carved in elegant script. I couldn't resist. Using a crowbar from the shed, I pried it open. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed letters, and a child's porcelain doll with one eye missing. The letters were addressed to someone named Eleanor, written in a jagged hand that grew increasingly frantic over time. One phrase appeared repeatedly, scrawled in dark ink: "It's coming for me." The shadows in the house seemed darker after that. Doors closed on their own, and the air grew colder, no matter how high I turned up the heat. Luna refused to leave my side, her green eyes darting to unseen corners. But it wasn't until the fourth night that I truly understood the weight of the warnings. As I lay in bed, the tapping returned, this time accompanied by the creak of footsteps. They grew louder, closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded as the doorknob turned slowly, the metallic squeal piercing the silence. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the yawning darkness of the hallway. My breath hitched as I gripped the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand, the beam trembling along with my hands. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the icy room. I thought I heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, drifting down the hall. My stomach churned, the sound so incongruous with the oppressive atmosphere. Summoning courage I didn't feel, I stepped into the hallway. The house was eerily still, save for the faint rustling of curtains in the draft. The giggle echoed again, this time from the stairs. I hesitated, my feet glued to the floor, but curiosity outweighed fear. With each creak of the steps beneath me, I felt as though I was descending into another world, a realm where logic and safety didn't exist. The source of the sound seemed to lead me to the living room. It was there I saw her for the first time, a pale figure of a little girl standing by the window. Her white dress shimmered faintly in the moonlight, but her features were obscured by shadow. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned slowly, and for a moment I saw her face. Her hollow eyes were black as pitch, her mouth twisted in an unnatural smile. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone, dissolving into the air like mist. I stumbled back, colliding with the coffee table and sending a framed photograph crashing to the floor. When I picked it up, I froze. It wasn't my photograph. The frame held an image of a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, standing in front of what looked like my house. The date scrawled on the back read 1947. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every shadow seemed charged with malevolent intent. When morning came, I drove to the library, desperate for answers. The librarian, a kind but cautious woman named Mrs. Hargrove, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the address. "Blackthorn Road?" she asked, her voice laced with unease. "That house has a history." "What kind of history?" I pressed, leaning over the counter. She hesitated before pulling out a dusty file. The house belonged to the Larkins family in the 1940s. Eleanor Larkins was the youngest daughter. They say she disappeared one night, and the family fell apart after that. Her mother was institutionalized, and her father, well, he was found dead in the basement. People claimed he was raving about hearing Eleanor's voice calling to him from the walls. My stomach twisted. And the doll? The one in the attic? Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened. That was Eleanor's. She carried it everywhere. If it's still there, maybe she is too. The words chilled me to the bone. When I returned to the house, it felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. The doll was exactly where I'd left it, staring blankly at me from its perch in the attic. "Eleanor," I said softly, clutching the doll, "are you here?" The response was immediate, a loud crash from downstairs. I bolted, heart racing, only to find the dining room chairs stacked in a precarious pyramid in the center of the room. Luna hissed at the formation, her tail puffed out like a bottle brush. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the whispers began again, louder and more distinct. "Help me," the voice said, clear as day. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The voice lingered in the air, pressing against me like an unseen force. "Help me," it said again, echoing in my mind even after the house fell silent. The chairs in the dining room toppled over with a loud crash, but I barely noticed. Something, or someone, was demanding my attention. I spent the next day combing through the letters I'd found in the attic. They were desperate pleas, written to someone named Margaret. The writer described a growing dread, a shadow that moved within the house, and Eleanor's worsening behavior. Words like possessed and unholy jumped off the pages, their intensity increasing with each letter. The final note, smeared with what I hoped was ink, ended abruptly. "It's inside her now. God forgive me." That night, I decided to stay awake, armed with a flashlight and a recorder I'd bought in town. If Eleanor, or whatever was haunting the house, wanted my attention, I'd give it, but I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. At first, the hours passed uneventfully. The only sounds were the occasional groan of the old wood and Luna's soft breathing. But around 3 a.m., the air shifted. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The recorder picked up faint whispers, too low to make out. "Eleanor," I said, my voice shaking. "If you're here, give me a sign." The flashlight flickered, its beam narrowing until it barely illuminated the room. Then, the doll, the one I'd left in the attic, rolled into the center of the room. My heart stopped. I hadn't brought it down. "Help me," the voice returned, this time louder and closer. I turned toward the sound and froze. The little girl stood in the doorway, her form hazy yet unmistakable. Her dark, hollow eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something behind them, a flicker of fear, as though she too was trapped. "What do you need?" I whispered. She pointed to the basement door. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Something compelled me to follow. With trembling hands, I opened the door, revealing the steep, creaky staircase. The air grew heavier with each step, and the faint scent of decay wafted up to meet me. At the bottom, the basement was pitch black, save for the flashlight beam bouncing off concrete walls. In the far corner, a strange symbol was drawn on the floor in what looked like dried blood. Surrounding it were burnt-out candles and what appeared to be the charred remains of a book. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" I asked aloud. A sudden gust extinguished the flashlight, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged as whispers erupted around me, overlapping and growing louder until they were a deafening roar. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight just as the whispers stopped. The little girl stood inches from me now, her face twisted in anguish. "It's coming," she whispered. "It's coming, and it won't let me go." Before I could respond, the walls began to shake. The symbol on the floor glowed faintly, and the shadows in the room coalesced into a towering figure with glowing red eyes. Its voice boomed, low and guttural, reverberating through the room. "Leave this place," it commanded. I stumbled backward, my legs barely carrying me up the stairs. The door slammed shut behind me, and the house felt eerily quiet. The next morning I reached out to Mrs. Hargrove. Her face paled as I recounted what I'd seen. "The Larkins family wasn't the only one," she confessed. "There have been others, all with the same story. Darkness, possession, and a shadowy figure. No one stays in that house for long." "Why hasn't anyone torn it down?" I demanded. She shook her head. "People tried. But every time something happens, accidents, disappearances, it's as though the house refuses to be destroyed." I realized then that leaving wouldn't be enough. Whatever held Eleanor captive wouldn't let her go, and if I didn't find a way to end it, I might be next. The house seemed angrier after my discovery in the basement. The walls groaned with a relentless intensity, and the whispers grew louder, their words more menacing. Luna had stopped eating, her once lustrous fur dull and matted. She stared at corners of the room where nothing visible moved, her low growl a constant reminder that we weren't alone. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. Eleanor was trapped, and whatever force held her would likely claim another victim if I abandoned the house. Armed with salt, candles, and a crucifix I'd borrowed from the local church, I prepared to confront the entity. Mrs. Hargrove had been reluctant to help, but she eventually gave me an old journal she'd found among the library's archives. It detailed a ritual, a cleansing that required courage, focus, and the strength to face one's deepest fears. "Be careful," she warned. "If you falter, it could consume you." The instructions were straightforward. Create a protective circle, light the candles, and recite the incantation. But there was a catch. The ritual demanded an offering, a piece of the house's history. I knew immediately what I needed: the doll. As night fell, the house seemed to anticipate my plan. The whispers turned into shouts, the walls quaking as I retrieved the doll from the attic. The little girl appeared again, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice filled with despair. "It's too strong." "I have to try," I replied, clutching the doll tightly. Down in the basement, I set everything up as instructed. The protective circle was made of salt, the candles arranged in a precise pattern. The symbol on the floor still glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. As I began the incantation, the house erupted in fury. The shadows grew darker, forming tendrils that lashed out at the circle. The figure with glowing red eyes appeared again, larger and more menacing than before. "You dare defy me?" it bellowed, its voice shaking the walls. I forced myself to keep going, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. The entity slammed against the circle, its rage palpable, but the salt held firm. "Release her," I shouted, holding up the doll. "Let Eleanor go." The entity howled, its form distorting. Eleanor appeared beside me, her ghostly figure trembling. "You can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "It won't let me." "Yes, it will," I insisted, lighting the doll on fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the porcelain and releasing an acrid smoke that filled the room. The entity screeched, its form unraveling as the flames grew brighter. "No," it cried, its voice a mixture of rage and agony. The glowing symbol on the floor faded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Eleanor turned to me, her hollow eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a bittersweet relief. "I'm free." With those words she dissolved into a soft light that filled the room before disappearing entirely. The house fell silent. For the first time since I'd moved in, it felt still. I left that night, taking only what I could carry. Luna, too, seemed lighter, her eyes brighter as we drove away. In the weeks that followed, the house was demolished. Workers reported strange occurrences, tools vanishing, sudden gusts of wind, but the structure eventually came down. Nothing was built in its place. I've since moved far away, but I can still hear her voice sometimes, soft and distant. "Thank you," she says, a reminder of the life I helped free and the darkness I left behind. The house may be gone, but its memory lingers, a testament to the horrors it once held. The house stood at the edge of the woods, its towering silhouette bathed in the pale light of the setting sun. Tall, narrow windows glinted like watchful eyes, and ivy crept along the crumbling brick walls like veins on old skin. The air around it seemed still, too still, as if the house had exhaled its last breath long ago and was waiting for someone to wake it. For 17-year-old Rachel Green, it was the perfect place to start over, or so her father insisted. "This is it," her dad said, forcing a smile as he stepped out of the car. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoed louder than it should have. "I know it's a little rustic, but it's ours now. A fresh start, huh?" Rachel didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the attic window, where she thought she saw a shadow move. She blinked, and it was gone. Inside, the house was no less foreboding. Dust blanketed every surface, and the faint scent of decay clung to the air. The wooden floorboards groaned underfoot as they explored, their sounds swallowed by the oppressive silence. Her younger brother, Jamie, trailed behind her, clutching his stuffed rabbit like a talisman. "This place smells like dead people," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't be dramatic," Rachel replied, though she felt a chill run down her spine. By nightfall, they had settled into their new rooms. Rachel's was at the far end of the second floor, its single window overlooking the woods. She tried to focus on unpacking, but an inexplicable unease gnawed at her. The shadows seemed deeper here, darker, and the creaks of the house too deliberate. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the wall behind her bed. Rachel held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped altogether. The next morning, her father dismissed her concerns. "Old houses make noises," he said, sipping his coffee. "It's just the pipes or the wood settling." But Rachel wasn't convinced. That night, she pressed her ear to the wall, waiting. The tapping began again, but this time it was accompanied by a faint whisper. A voice, low and indistinct, like someone speaking through a fog. Her hands trembled as she turned on the bedside lamp and called out, "Who's there?" The whispering stopped. In the weeks that followed, the house revealed more of its secrets. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered without warning. Jamie started waking up screaming, claiming he saw the man with no face in his room. Her father grew irritable, brushing off their fears as childish imagination. But Rachel knew something was wrong. The house was alive, and it was watching them. The third week in the house was when everything began to spiral. The atmosphere inside grew heavier, almost suffocating. Rachel often felt the prickling sensation of eyes on her back, though she was alone. The tapping behind her wall returned nightly, and now it was joined by the distinct sound of footsteps pacing the attic above her room. One evening, Rachel decided she'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the creaking attic stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. Jamie had begged her not to go, clinging to her arm as tears streamed down his face. "What if it's the man with no face?" he whispered. "There's no such thing," Rachel said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'll prove it, okay?" The attic was a cavernous space, filled with old furniture draped in yellowed sheets and boxes labeled in faded handwriting. The beam of her flashlight cut through the thick layer of dust hanging in the air. Nothing moved, but the silence was deafening. She approached the window at the far end, the one she'd seen the shadow in on their first day. As she drew closer, her flashlight flickered. She froze, her breath hitching. The beam sputtered out, plunging her into darkness. And then she heard it. A deep, guttural sigh, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. Rachel bolted, nearly tumbling down the stairs in her rush to escape. She slammed the attic door behind her and leaned against it, her entire body trembling. Her father found her minutes later, pale and shaking. "What's going on up there?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Something's in the attic," Rachel gasped. "I heard it, I swear." Her father sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Rachel, you're scaring Jamie with all this nonsense. There's nothing here but us." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That night, Jamie's screams tore through the house. Rachel ran to his room, finding him curled up in a corner, his stuffed rabbit clutched to his chest. He pointed to the closet, his tiny hand trembling. "It's in there," he sobbed. "The man with no face." Rachel hesitated, her stomach churning. She opened the closet door slowly, bracing herself for what she might find. But there was nothing, just clothes and a few scattered toys. She turned back to Jamie, who stared at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "He's real," he whispered, "and he's angry." Rachel didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by Jamie's bed, keeping watch. The house was silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left her. The next morning, she decided to confide in the only other person who might believe her. Her neighbor, Mrs. Winslow, a reclusive old woman who had lived in the area for decades. "You live in the Harper house now?" Mrs. Winslow asked when Rachel mentioned the address. Her face darkened, and she leaned in closer. "You need to leave. That house is cursed. Always has been." Rachel's throat tightened. "Why? What happened there?" Mrs. Winslow hesitated, her hands trembling. "A tragedy. Long ago. The Harpers built that house, but none of them lived to see it finished. Death followed them, and anyone who's lived there since, well, they don't stay long." Rachel's hands grew cold. She didn't know whether to believe the old woman's stories, but deep down, she felt the truth of her words. That night, the house felt angrier than ever. The tapping was louder, the whispers clearer. This time, Rachel could make out the words, "Get out." She knew they were running out of time. Rachel's resolve to protect her family solidified as the disturbances grew increasingly violent. The once random flickering of lights now felt deliberate, as if the house itself were taunting them. Doors slammed shut on their own, and cold drafts swept through the halls despite every window being closed. Jamie refused to sleep in his room, and her father's temper grew shorter each day. One evening, Rachel decided to confront the entity plaguing them. She borrowed a digital recorder from school, planning to capture evidence of the strange occurrences. Armed with the recorder and a crucifix from her grandmother's jewelry box, she set up in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered into the stillness. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "Why are you here? What do you want from us?" The silence stretched on, thick and unnerving. Then, just as Rachel was about to give up, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the recorder in her hand crackled with static. A low, raspy voice emerged from the static. "Leave, before it's too late." Rachel's blood ran cold. She played the recording back several times, each playback confirming what she had heard. It was undeniable. Someone or something was speaking to her. She showed the recording to her father that night, hoping to finally convince him of the danger they were in. But instead of the concern she had anticipated, his face twisted with anger. "Enough, Rachel," he snapped. "I've had it with these games. You're scaring your brother for no reason." "It's not a game," Rachel yelled, her voice cracking. "You heard it. Something is in this house, and it wants us gone." Her father shook his head, rubbing his temples. "We're not leaving, Rachel. I can't afford to uproot us again. You'll just have to deal with it." Rachel stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. How could he not see it? How could he ignore what was happening right in front of them? That night, the house retaliated. The tapping on the walls turned into a violent pounding, shaking the very foundation. Jamie's screams echoed down the hall as the temperature in the house dropped to an unbearable chill. Rachel raced to his room, finding him standing in the corner, staring at something she couldn't see. "He's here," Jamie whispered, his voice eerily calm. Rachel turned, and for a fleeting moment she saw it, a tall, shadowy figure with indistinct features standing in the doorway. Its presence was suffocating, its malice palpable. She grabbed Jamie and ran, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Rachel made a decision. If her father wouldn't listen, she'd find another way to protect her family. She returned to Mrs. Winslow's house, desperate for guidance. "I told you to leave," Mrs. Winslow said when she opened the door. "The longer you stay, the stronger it gets." "I can't leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "My dad won't believe me. Isn't there anything I can do?" Mrs. Winslow hesitated before ushering her inside. She handed Rachel an old leather-bound book. Its pages were filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes. "This is all I have," Mrs. Winslow said. "It belonged to my grandmother. She believed it could ward off evil spirits. But be warned, it's dangerous to confront what you don't fully understand." Rachel thanked her and hurried home, clutching the book tightly. That night, as the house groaned and whispered around her, she prepared for a battle she wasn't sure she could win. She opened the book and began to read. The night was eerily silent as Rachel sat in the center of the living room, the leather-bound book spread open before her. The symbols and incantations seemed to pulse on the page, their meanings elusive yet powerful. Jamie sat close by, clutching his stuffed rabbit, his wide eyes filled with both fear and trust. Her father, though still skeptical, lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "What do you even think this will accomplish?" "Protecting us," Rachel replied firmly. She took a deep breath and began to read the incantation aloud. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as she pressed on. The words felt foreign and heavy on her tongue, like they carried an ancient weight. As the final syllable left her lips, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and the faint smell of decay wafted through the space. Jamie whimpered, clinging to her arm while her father straightened, his face pale. The lights flickered violently, and then, one by one, they went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering flames of the candles Rachel had lit as part of the ritual. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living things. And then it appeared. The shadowy figure that had haunted them emerged from the corner of the room, its form towering and indistinct, the man with no face. Its presence was suffocating, its malice tangible. The air seemed to hum with its rage as it advanced toward them. "Leave us alone!" Rachel shouted, holding up the crucifix. The entity stopped, its featureless head tilting as if studying her. "You don't belong here," she continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is our home now, and you will not harm my family." The entity let out a guttural growl, a sound that shook the very walls. The candles flickered wildly, and Rachel felt a force pushing against her, trying to break her resolve. She clutched the crucifix tighter, her hands trembling, and recited the incantation again, louder this time. As the final words echoed through the room, the entity recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted as if trying to pull it back. With one last unearthly scream, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving the room deathly still. The lights flickered back on, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Jamie sobbed quietly, burying his face in Rachel's side, while her father stood frozen, his face ashen. What was that?" he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "The thing you didn't believe in," Rachel said, her voice hard. For the first time, her father looked at her with something other than dismissal. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "You're right, we're not safe here." The family packed what they could that night, leaving behind the house and its malevolent presence. As they drove away, Rachel glanced back at the attic window. For a moment she thought she saw the shadow watching them, but then it was gone. They never returned to the house, and Rachel never spoke of what happened that night. But she kept the leather-bound book, a reminder of the battle she had fought and won. Even now, years later, she sometimes dreams of the man with no face, standing in the shadows, waiting. And every time she wakes with the same thought: some doors should never be opened.